Hello, I'm Professor Congleton, and this is Econ 411, Lecture 6A, the beginning of the new block of material just after the midterm. So let me first begin by talking a little bit about where we are in the course. So part one of the course, the review of different philosophical ideas and how they affect assessments of the relative merits of commerce, careers in commerce, and the extent to which commerce should play a role in a good life and a good society. So that material, for the purposes of the course, the overall trajectory of the course, is there partly to show you that different views of the world exist. That's fairly obvious. That they can have a coherent basis, right? They aren't arbitrary. They start with principles. They have implications that are logically consistent, and that they can lead to different ideas about the proper extent of commerce in a good life and good society. And that these ideas have changed through time. Right? It's important for the purposes of this course to be able to say that, well, sure, ethical ideas change through time, and in some cases, those changes have systematic effects on economic development, and therefore are important. Right? If you want to think about economic trajectories in one country or differences among countries, then differences in beliefs about the proper place for commerce in a good society and a good life may be quite important, and arguably were important in the period that led up to the Great Acceleration and the emergence of the commercial society of the 20th century that we more or less take for granted today in most of the West. So the first snippet of game theory that we went through showed why ethics could matter. Right? It's one thing to think that ethics are important in some kind of metaphysical sense. It's another thing to say that ethical dispositions have practical relevance, that they actually affect the real world in some sense, not just how you think about the world, but they have real consequences. And what we showed in block 5, the lecture series 5A and 5B, and I think there was a 5C, was that social dilemmas, which would otherwise block economic development or social development, can be solved, and probably often were solved through changes in ethical rules that people internalized, and which came to be part of themselves, part of the way they saw the world, and influenced the way they made choices in situations that otherwise would have been problematic, that otherwise would have generated results worse than could be achieved by the individuals in their given societies with a given technology. And that, of course, is important. Right? It implies that economic development is not really a technological phenomenon entirely, okay, although technology has something to do with it, and we'll talk more about that later in this block of material. But that ideas about right and wrong, good and bad, better and worse, influence behavior that can influence both the emergence of peaceful societies, viable societies, societies in which externalities are moderate, societies in which different types of rules might determine behavior. As, for example, we talked about privatization versus sharing rules as ways of addressing the Hardin problems, and also addressing the Hobbes problems. One of these solutions, partitioning, will tend to support market development, whereas the other, sharing, tends not to, because shares aren't usually tradable, whereas partitionable things often are. So what we're going to do in this section, section 6, is to go through some dilemmas that are specifically economic. And we're going to basically be assuming that these other problems that we've covered in block 5 have been solved. So we've dealt with the worst aspects of conflict, we've dealt with the worst aspects of commons problems, we've dealt with the worst externalities, we've produced the most important public goods. And now we're thinking about how a society that has reached that stage might develop a market, tradable goods, things that people, produce specifically so that they can trade them for other things with other people. And that trading mechanism is not entirely obvious. Some people argue that it kind of emerged out of a kind of a gift-giving kind of tradition. I give you this, and you reciprocate by giving me something back. Okay, well, that looks like trade to an economist, but it might be motivated with some kind of idea about gift-giving in the beginning. So the idea of trade itself is actually not obvious. Right? You're giving up control over something and transferring that control to some other person. And it's not always possible to do that. There are lots of things in the world that you might control, but you aren't allowed to sell. So for example, your person, right? In a society without slavery, you can't literally sell yourself to another person. You might rent yourself out in a sense, right? So you might hire yourself out for wages and give your employer some ability to impose duties on you, ask you to do things, tell you to do things, and so forth. So you can trade services, but you wouldn't in a society in which slave trade is illegal, literally be able to sell yourself into some kind of servitude. What we're going to do to begin with is just start thinking about exchange. Okay, what kinds of ethical dispositions tend to facilitate exchange? And to do that, we're going to have to kind of challenge some economic intuitions that you may have picked up along the way. These intuitions are fine. They're good rules of thumb in a contemporary society. But if you think about them using game theory, it turns out that mutual gains to trade are not always realized. And they're not always realized for various reasons, which we're going to start going through today. Okay. So what I have on the board here, the whiteboard, is a small gain matrix. And normally I always use the smallest gain matrix that really lends itself to illustrating the dilemma I want to illustrate. So a 2x2 works fine for this one. And obviously you can think of trades that are more complicated, but the 2x2 version is fine. This particular version is very much like the textbook version that you learn when you go through competitive market theory. There are no transactions costs. People know exactly what the terms of trade are. They know what they're getting, what they're giving up. There's no ambiguity. There's no fraud. There's no chance to steal something, right? The property is kind of, property rights are well established and respected. And we're just trying to think of the essence of trade, even in this really simple environment. And if you're taking notes, which you should be, it might be a good point now to kind of just pause the thing and the recording and copy down the matrix in your notes. Okay, now, the idea of trade is it takes an offer from a seller and acceptance by a buyer in order for a trade to take place. Each person has veto power over whether the trade takes place. So if either person decides not to do it, not to make the offer or not to accept the offer, then the trade doesn't take place. And so if there are gains to trade, which here I'm just assuming are identical or equal, 3-3, they don't have to be, of course. And then all the other cells are zeros, double zeros. So nothing happens in those other cells. There's no trade taking place. And it doesn't matter whether one person says no or both people say no. No trade takes place in all those situations. So 3 of the 4 cells just have double zeros in them. And what we want to do is go through the standard game theory drill and try to figure out what the equilibria of this choice setting look like. Right? So we're going to use the standard MASH non-cooperative game theory that we used in the previous section. So let's imagine we're the buyer, and if the seller makes an offer, we have a choice between accepting the offer and not accepting the offer. Okay, 3 is better than 0. right? So 3 is what we'll choose. On the other hand, if the seller doesn't make an offer, okay, door is locked when we get to the shop. Okay, we have a choice of accepting the offer, except nothing happens in that case, or not accepting the offer, turning around and going home. And 0 is 0, so they're the same. So you're indifferent between those two strategies in that situation. So there's no pure dominant strategy for the buyer. Now, let's think of the seller's situation. The seller can be thinking, okay, well, if the buyer is going to accept the offer, I'm choosing between 3 and 0. 3 is better, so I'll accept it in that situation. I mean, I'll make the offer and he'll accept it. On the other hand, if the buyer doesn't accept the offer, I'm choosing between 0 and 0. I'm really indifferent between those two outcomes, 0 and 0. And so, either strategy will do. But notice that there are two Nash equilibria in this game, one here and one here. There are two places where both strategies are underlined, right? And that implies that those outcomes are stable ones. Okay, there's no incentive for either person to change their strategy, given what the other has done. And so we have two Nash equilibria in this case. So one is where trade takes place, and one is where trade doesn't take place. And so from the game theory we used last time, it would not be possible to conclude definitely that trade would take place. So even this very simple circumstance that's very similar to the assumed setting of competitive markets and neoclassical price theory, no guarantee of trade taking place if people are making choices independently of one another and in the manner of non-cooperative game theory. Okay, now as a footnote, you could say that if we had a slightly more sophisticated way of thinking about this, there would be a natural equilibrium. Notice that this one is the 3-3 one is weakly dominant over the 0-0 one, in the sense that if people chose their strategies trying to figure out the accept strategies or offer strategies relative to the don't strategies, it turns out that the accept strategy is always at least as good as the don't strategy. Okay, and when they're different, the accept strategy is always better. So you could argue that the accept strategy from the buyer's point of view is weakly dominant, right? It's a good strategy to take in every situation. It never generates a lower payoff than the other one. And the same thing is true of the seller in this case. The seller's offer strategy generates a payoff that's always at least as high as that available from the don't strategy, from the not making an offer strategy. And therefore, it could also be said to be weakly dominant. And if weak dominance is enough, then only the 3-3 equilibrium emerges. Okay, so it is possible that the normal, kind of classroom result could apply in a situation where there's no uncertainty about the quality of the products, exactly what the offers are, and there's no transactions costs. So what I want to do next is to modify this game to include transactions costs. So we've done what I've got written up here as A. We're now going to do B. Okay, and to do that, I'm going to redo this matrix, and I suggest that you redraw this matrix in your notes rather than try to modify yours. I'm just keeping it on the same spot in the blackboard, on the whiteboard, just to make my life a little easier. So I'm erasing a lot of the detail that we added. Right, so I'm now taking us back to the original blank board before we figured out where the equilibria were. And the next thing I want to do is add in transactions costs. So what is a transactions cost? Well, a transactions cost is the cost of you, or the opportunity cost of you going to the shop and seeing whether an offer that is available or not if you're the buyer. Right? If you go to the shop, and which is kind of like the accept offer strategy, and the shop is closed, you're worse off. You spent some time, right? So the buyer's payoff for the offer strategy differs from 0 in that case, the buyer would get some loss. And I'm just going to call the loss -1. On the other hand, the seller's in the same kind of situation. If he makes an offer and buyers don't show up, he's gone through some time and trouble to make the offer, do some advertising, put a sign up, put the item on display, whatever, and nothing happens, right? So he's out, he has some opportunity costs that he's borne in order to make the offer. Okay, in some cases he's actually paid money out to make the offer. In other cases it's simply his time and trouble. Now, if nothing happens, the 0-0 cell is still a reasonable number, right? A reasonable way of characterizing that outcome. No offers made, no effort to accept an offer has been made, so there are no transactions costs borne, and so 0-0 happens. No gains to trade are realized, no costs are borne. Now, you could argue that you subtract out these transactions costs from 3-3, and they really should become 2-2. Okay, because net of transactions costs, the benefit of 3 is offset by the expense of participating in that transaction. So I'm going to change these two numbers to 2s to reflect that. Okay, it's not really an important part of the process, but it's a logical part, and I just thought, why not make the matrix sensible? Okay, internally consistent. All right, so again, we go through the same process of trying to find the Nash equilibria, and it will turn out that the same cells are Nash equilibria again. So let's do that kind of quickly. So if the buyer thinks the seller is going to make an offer, he's choosing between 2 and 0. 2 is better. If the buyer thinks the seller isn't going to make an offer, the buyer is choosing between -1 and 0. 0 is better. Okay, notice there's no indifference in this case because of the transactions cost. On the other hand, if we go through the same logic for the seller, if the seller thinks the buyer is going to accept the offer, then 2 is better than 0, 2. And if the buyer is going to reject the offer, not accept the offer, then the seller chooses between -1 and 0 is better. So again, there are two Nash equilibria. And again, they're both locally stable. But notice in this case, there isn't that escape of saying, oh, well, with weak dominance, we could assure a single equilibrium emerges. In this case, there is no weak dominance. Right? It's not true that accepting an offer is always at least as good as rejecting an offer. And that's because if the seller doesn't make an offer, you're going to wind up with -1 instead of 0. Right? You would be better off not accepting the offer in that case, or not pursuing an offer. So in this case, with just a little bit of transactions costs, that neoclassical result goes away. Right? There's no way of reasoning to all gains to trade will be realized. Okay, some will, and some not. So what's an example of this in the real world? Well, in the real world, we all have stuff tucked away in our closets. I have storage rooms. Actually, I have a storage facility, and as a consequence, a lot of that stuff really should be put up for sale on Craigslist and gotten rid of. Okay, but I don't do that because there's time and energy involved, and I'm not sure I'm going to be able to sell it. And I'm not sure exactly whether the market's going to be there. And that's in part because buyers are going through a kind of a similar process. They're thinking, well, should I really look through Craigslist carefully for this option? The thing I want may not be there. It's not that much harder to look at it, try to get it from somewhere else, or just do without. And so there's a lot of junk around that isn't truly junk. It's useful stuff, okay, that's in storage. That really would be better off in the hands of some other person, sold through, Craigslist or some other similar kind of service. And to the extent that these are non-trivial collections, this could be a good bit of stuff that's in this no trade cell. On the other hand, there are certainly things that sell on Craigslist and other web sources like that. And of course, in the old-fashioned for sales ads in newspapers that have been around for centuries before Craigslist emerged. So we know that this sell also is realistic. I mean, trades do take place. It's just that everything that should be traded isn't ordinarily traded. Okay, we're often in that cell. Now, you could say this is a type of dilemma, and that we might want to think about somehow avoiding the cell. We could do it in principle, I suppose, by reducing the transactions costs. And that's kind of what Craigslist did. So in principle, you would think that the net effect of Craigslist would be that people would have less junk in storage that should be traded to other people who would value it. In the East, we often call kind of used stuff marketplaces flea markets, because some of the stuff has fleas, I guess, in the old days, and it's less common today. But other places call it trash and treasure, and that's because one person's trash could be another person's treasure, something that they actually would find useful and valuable to add to their collections. Okay, so if you think back to when we went through the Adam Smith material, Smith does not really talk about gains to trade much. It's kind of implicit in a lot of what he talks about, but he doesn't have a real clear statement of gains to trade. What he talks about in terms of the motivation for trade are two things. One is an instinct, he says, that people in his community at least have that leads them to truck, barter, and exchange. Okay, that doesn't sound very grandiose. It just says people trade because they like doing it, right? And he also says that the accumulation of wealth is a way of becoming praiseworthy, of getting kind of a positive esteem from your neighbors and friends and so forth. And that might also be true of shrewd buying in markets. And you come home with something that's really marvelous, and your friends all kind of appreciate it, and, esteem you, praise you for your clever bargaining, your ability to find such a wonderful thing, and so on. Well, if you have cultural support, or if you have sort of ethical support for trade, such as a utilitarian might have, who believes every transaction increases aggregate utility as long as there's no fraud or coercion involved, and therefore is a good thing, okay, then the pursuit of trade would be inherently moral, right? And so there'd be kind of a virtue payoff added to the practical gains to trade that we've kind of identified here on the whiteboard. So if we add in, say, a virtue payoff for seeking out trade, or you can think of it as kind of cultural support for engaging in trade, as in the Smith claim, then there's going to be a little v here associated with both making offers and accepting offers, and there'll be a little v over here associated with accepting offers or pursuing offers that aren't made. And there'll be a little v here representing the value of making offers even when people don't accept them. So notice that the V, this sort of cultural support or ethical support for trade, will have an effect if it's large. Okay, that is, if a really small support for trade wouldn't change the incentives. But notice that if V is greater than 1, that only a single Nash equilibrium is still stable, okay, or exists, okay. So notice that this is no longer a Nash equilibrium because -1 plus V is greater than 0, right? As long as V is greater than 1, -1 plus V will be greater than 0. And in that case, there will be two dominant strategies, this one, and there'll be a single equilibrium. the trading one. So in a sense, Smith could be right that the reason a lot of trades take place in his community is because of this extra support for trade from either instinct or some social support for engaging in trades. But also this would be true of other ethical systems that tended to support trade as a noble or praiseworthy or moral activity. And so you would get more trade in a community that has this kind of support, moral or social support for trade, than you would in a community without it. Right? We would eliminate this this bottom cell as a possible equilibrium. Markets would be larger. And the larger markets are, the stronger the returns are for specialization. And the more specialization that takes place, the more efficient production tends to be, and the more stuff tends to be available for trade. And so such support can kind of have a multiplier effect in causing more and more stuff to be brought to market for trade. And markets will tend to become more efficient as institutions or mechanisms through which people could achieve income and material comfort. Now notice that the opposite is true if you have a culture that's anti-trade. Right? So if instead of support for trade, as in Smith's community, you had opposition to trade, as in Erasmus and Moore, well, then less trade is going to take place, right? So instead of a V greater than 1, you might have a G, guilt associated with engaging in trade. In effect, the V's would be negative rather than positive numbers. And so the gains to trade would go down, and the transaction cost effect would be reinforced. Right? And that tends to make this equilibrium more stable. And in fact, if the gilt is high enough, the gilt might overwhelm modest gains to trade that exist and cause even some of the trades that were taking place before to disappear. Right, so if an anti-trade environment will tend to reduce the scope of trade by increasing the attractiveness, in a sense, of this lower right-hand equilibrium, and that will tend to reduce the amount of specialization, reduce the efficiency of production for markets, and tend to create a society that's materially less wealthy, less rich, less comfortable. Right, so we can use this matrix to see why I thought that those ethical ideas were important. Right? In part 1, we went through all those ethical ideas, and we saw that, well, these different theories had different implications about careers in commerce and commerce itself. And I argued kind of in the background implicitly that this was important. But this game matrix shows you why that's important. Such ideas have direct effect on the scope of exchange, and therefore on the average level of material comfort in a given society, that society's prosperity. And with that, I'll stop this block of material, and I'll see you next time.